How many of you understood the sermon title in the bulletin this week? No, okay. Half of you haven't even looked at it. Okay, it's confession time now. We can go back and do confession again if we need to, Ken. It's a good sermon title that I figured you wouldn't understand, and I figured you would look at it and say, what? But it's Basi, Genug, Assez, and Suficiente. That was pretty good, wasn't it? It's got the accent. What's that? None of that was Latin or German, I don't think, but yeah, maybe one was German, yeah. Yeah. You know what that means? Any of those things mean? Okay, well, I'll let you know in a little bit. But, you know, let's set that aside and we'll get to it, because first I want you to focus on that first scripture. The apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And we've all prayed a prayer like that before. It's not uncommon, in fact. Maybe, and there are certain times, I think, when it's even more prevalent. Maybe whenever we're whispering in a hospital waiting room or muttered during a difficult conversation. Maybe looking at a pile of bills in front of you at some point. And we want to believe more. We want to trust more. We want to hope more. We want to be strong in our faith. That's our desire. So when the disciples asked Jesus in Luke 17:5, increase our faith, it sounds like a great request. I mean, who wouldn't want more faith? That's a given. But Jesus' answer is probably not what they expected. He doesn't give them more faith. He doesn't rebuke them for asking. Instead, he points to something tiny, something very insignificant, a mustard seed, and then tells this parable about a servant simply doing his job. Now, most of the time, preachers explain this text by saying the disciples didn't have enough faith, and Jesus was showing them how little their faith was. But what if Jesus wasn't scolding them? What if he was saying, you already have enough faith? The issue isn't quantity, but practice. Stop waiting for more and start using what you already have. And that's what I want us to hear today is that you already have enough faith for what God is asking you to do. Seems like a strange concept, but it's true. The request comes in this context in the Scripture because just before this, Jesus had talked to the disciples about forgiving and forgiving over and over again. And so no wonder they said, increase our faith, because it's going to be hard to forgive that much. It sounds impossible. And so they assumed that they needed a bigger tank or reservoir of faith to handle that kind of obedience to forgive. And I think we often think the same way. If only I had more faith, I'd be able to handle this. If only I had more faith, I'd be more willing to talk about my faith. If only I had more faith, I'd give more generously. If only I had more faith, I would trust God through this illness. We imagine sometimes faith being like money in a bank account. If we have more savings, we feel more secure. If I had more faith, I'd feel strong. But Jesus says faith doesn't work like that. He points to the smallest thing maybe that the disciples could imagine. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, this legendary tiny, it was interesting that Amber, her example of something small was a seed. I loved that, and then she threw me completely off of what I was going to talk, because I didn't expect that at all. But this mustard seed was the least of all things. In fact, in Jewish sayings, the mustard seed is equated to that least of all things. But notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, if only you had a mountain of faith. He says, if you've got a speck, it's enough. By the way, those words in the sermon title mean enough, sufficient. The power of faith is not in its size, but in its object. A little bit of faith in a great God is more than enough. I mean, think about it. A child doesn't need to understand the laws of physics to believe and to have faith that their parent can take them across a busy street. You don't need to know everything about how airplanes work, although Richard could tell you. But you don't need to know everything about how airplanes work in order to be, bold enough to get on a flight. And you don't need to possess these heroic amounts of faith in order to step out and be obedient to Christ. You don't need more faith. You need to use the faith. We need to use the faith that we already have. Imagine Jesus leaning into the disciples and saying, hey guys, you don't need more. I mean, you've already left your nets, your families, your businesses. I mean, you're walking with me. That shows that you believe. You're already there. What you need is not an increase, but to act on what you've been given. It's like standing in front of the refrigerator and thinking to yourself, if I only had something to eat. And we've all done that. You stand in front of the refrigerator and there's nothing in there to eat. Okay, I mean, let's be real. But you can't really use it, or it doesn't help you unless you access it. Or someone holding a set of car keys and saying, if I only had a way to drive. The problem is not supply, but use. The New Testament gives this beautiful word for this idea of sufficiency. And Jeff, you can correct me on this. I'm not going to pronounce it right. I think it's hikonos. It means sufficient, adequate, enough. And Luke uses it a bunch of times. When Jesus talks to the centurion in Luke 7, the centurion says, I'm not worthy. I'm not sufficient for you to come to my roof. And he's literally saying, I'm not enough. But when Jesus speaks of what the disciples already possess, he implies the opposite, that it is enough, that their faith is hikonos. It is enough. It's sufficient. There's enough there. Another Greek word that I'll butcher as well, but orkatos, shows up in Matthew's gospel when he says, sufficient is the day in its own trouble. In other words, God gives us what is sufficient, enough for the challenge of the day. There's not excess, there's not surplus, but there's enough. I think that's exactly what Jesus is saying to the disciples. They don't need more faith stacked up like backstock in the back of a grocery store. They already have sufficient faith, enough, adequate to be obedient to what they've been called to do. And then, strangely enough, Jesus drives this point home with this little parable. He describes a servant who's been plowing or tending sheep all day, and when he comes in, his master doesn't say, sit down and eat. Instead, the servant prepares the master's meal and serves and then eats afterward, because that's the servant's duty. Now, what's the connection to faith? Well, it's not difficult. Faith is lived out in daily obedience, in small things, not in heroic moments. The servant doesn't ask for new tools every morning. He uses what he already has. And likewise, disciples, you and I, don't need to wait for more faith to fall from heaven before obeying, before doing what God's called us to do. We simply step out in faith, and we use what we've got, because faith is not measured in how much we have, but in whether we put it to use. And then there's that mustard seed. The seed's small, nearly invisible, but packed with life. You've all, most of you have been in church for many, many years, and you've heard 1,000 different stories about how mustard seeds will just take over, left untended. And Jesus says that even that little bitty thing can grow so big. Even that much faith, that faith of a mustard seed, that small amount, can uproot a mulberry tree. That little bit of faith can do impossible things. And there's examples of that all through the Scripture. Noah built an ark not because he had massive faith, but because he trusted one command. David picked up 5 stones not because he was fearless, but because he trusted God. And the woman who touched the hem of Christ's garment didn't give this grand speech of faith and what her expectation were upon touching. She simply reached out in trembling faith and trust, and she was healed. The point is not how big their faith was. The point is how big their God was. How about us? What does it mean to take those things that are in our lives and use our faith to address them? Maybe it's just forgiving someone who's hurt you. Maybe it is feeling, or maybe it is giving generously when money's tight. Maybe it's not stressing out over this upcoming hospital visit or test or clinicals, but trusting God for what you've prepared for. We trust God with our children and grandchildren's future. That takes faith, but we can do it. And these are not acts of super Christians. They're just mustard seed acts of ordinary believers. I mean, faith is like a muscle, and muscles don't grow by wishing for more. I learned that, several years ago. No matter how many books you read about exercise, until you actually lift the weights, the muscle doesn't change. The disciples said, increase our faith. Jesus said, use it. If you want stronger faith, exercise the faith you already have. Start small. Pray for something today. Step out in obedience today or tomorrow or the next day. Forgive one offense that has invaded your heart and that you think about. Forgive that. And as you act, your faith's going to grow. And then Jesus gives this reminder that is pretty humbling. So you also, when you've done everything you were told to do, should say, we're unworthy servants. We've only done our duty. Faith is not about feeling heroic or congratulating ourselves. It's simply trusting and obeying. It's doing what the Master asked because Jesus is Lord and we're the servants. That's the highest rank available to Christians, by the way. And that ought to give us some sense of freedom. I mean, we don't have to measure ourselves against anyone else in order to prove how much faith we have. We simply live it out, do our duty, trusting that God is at work in our lives. So what does it mean? It means a few things. Number one, stop waiting. You've got enough. Don't hold back from obedience. Don't hold back thinking, oh, if I just had more faith. You've got enough. And act on it. You need to pray, forgive, you need to serve. Take those steps, that next step that God has for you. And then trust that God is going to be in the results. Again, not the size of the faith, but the greatness of God that matters. Let me put it this way. If you trust Christ with your eternal salvation, well, surely God can handle tomorrow too, right? Today, don't despise that little speck of faith that you have, that mustard seed faith, and don't compare it to others. Don't wait till it gets bigger. Use it. Plan it. Put it into practice. Because in the hands of God, mustard seed faith can uproot trees, heal relationships, provide strength. It can literally change the world. And when all is said and done, we get this glorious, humble phrase that we can utter, we've done our duty. And that, brothers and sisters, is faith enough to make it happen. Thanks be to God.